Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
And good afternoon to all who are watching from afar. We come now to session 31 of our Bible story, and we reach the tremendously traumatic year of 167 BCE. That date to Jews is almost the equivalent of 1066 to us in England. It was traumatic. In fact, the whole of the session is going to be traumatic, not a happy story at all, but very compressed. Sometimes in the past we have travelled over 100, 150 years in one go, almost with a blink of an eye. Not this time. Events came hard and fast, and the time charts I've given you are just so packed with people and information which you do not need to remember. You just listen to the chaos and just realise how bad it was. So let's get started. Session 31 then, 167 BCE and the Maccabee family. Well, all had not been very well for the Jews of Jerusalem and Judea for some time before that year 167, the year when all tensions burst and everything went exceedingly wrong. After that year, life in Jerusalem and Judea would never, ever be the same again. The old establishment would be gone forever. There aren't many pictures this week, but the events moved almost too quickly for us to stop and get them. They're not very important anyway. Well, just before Prince Antiochus had arrived back from his hostage years in Rome, and the Seleucid kings found themselves impoverished by the might of the new emerging empire, a Benjaminite Jew called Simon had unbelievably sent a message to King Seleucus in Antioch to say there was lots of gold in the temple. The king was delighted to hear such good news, and at once sent his envoy Heliodorus to demand all the temple treasure from the high priest. The high priest was a very pious man, a very good high priest. He's called pious, but his name was Onias, and he was Onias III. But he refused to hand over the gold. But he set off at once to Antioch to explain matters to King Seleucus in person. But before he could get there, Heliodorus had murdered the king, and Prince Antiochus had arrived from Rome to claim the throne for himself. We've heard all this before. But there and then Onias had to wait. And while he waited, Simon, his relative, back in Jerusalem, tried again to make trouble. Sorry, not Simon, his relative, the Simon the Benjaminite, back in Jerusalem, tried again to make trouble. At first, however, the new king Antiochus IV, whose face you will remember, he had rejoiced in his new freedom in Syria after his years as a hostage in Rome. He proved, though, to be high-spirited, impulsive, and capricious. He'd begun to think of himself as a human god, often demanding divine honours from his servants, and sometimes even from his friends. Coins minted in his reign named him as Antiochus Epiphanes, but unknown to him, they called him Epimanes behind his back. Epimanes, the madman. His only creditable virtue was his good sense not to argue with Rome. While the high priest Onias, a very pious but conservative person who resisted all hints of change, while he was away from Jerusalem, other family members of the Tobiah clan had seen their chance to spend some money and transform Jerusalem into a typical Greek city with all its attractions for everyone's pleasure. They persuaded Onias's brother, Jason, note the Greek version of his name, Joshua. They persuaded Jason to try and bribe Antiochus IV with offers of money, to sideline Onias and appoint himself, Jason, as the new high priest in his place. It worked. Jason was still the right family of the Tobiads, but at last Jerusalem could now be transformed into a typical Greek city. A large gymnasium was built alongside the temple wall, which I gather is now being investigated by archaeologists. The games were established Greek style, and all this was greeted with great enthusiasm with the people of Jerusalem, including many members of the priests. And all of a sudden, the Jewish law and its precepts seemed very old-fashioned. Well, all this modernizing horrified the separatists as never before, even out in the countryside. They roused themselves in opposition and became active and known as the pious ones, or in Hebrew, the Hasidim. Events moved very quickly. A new precept had been established. If the high priest's job was up to the highest bidder, it wasn't long before there was another contender. A chap called Menelaus went to the king, offered him even more money, and got the job. Menelaus was described as possessing no qualifications for the high priesthood and having the hot temper of a cruel tyrant and the rage of a wild beast. But while he was still in Antioch, he conveniently arranged the murder of the old saintly high priest Onias, who was still there, before he set off back to Jerusalem to exert his authority over everyone. What a transformation. Jason wisely ran for his life. But back to the king. Antiochus IV had begun to have big ambitions to conquer Egypt, while that country was being ruled by a boy king and his incompetent regents. He fought 2 battles, in 169 and 168. He won the first battle easily, but a rumour arrived in Jerusalem soon after claiming that he'd been killed. Well, Jason returned straight away, captured Menelaus and killed all his cronies. And then Antiochus arrived, alive and well. He'd gained a victory, but he was furious with all the leaders in Jerusalem. Menelaus was immediately reinstated as the incompetent high priest, and Antiochus gave his army carte blanche to loot and kill in the city to their heart's content. The city walls were destroyed again, and a large fortress known as the Citadel was built overlooking the temple itself, in which to house the Syrian army. A year later, Antiochus won his next battle in Egypt. He seized the city of Memphis, but while on his way to be crowned as Pharaoh, a messenger arrived from Rome, demanding his instant withdrawal from Egypt. He complied for the first and only time in his life. He was under no illusion about the might of Rome, but he was furious and felt completely thwarted. He left Egypt in high dudgeon, and Jerusalem just happened to be his first port of call. There would be trouble, big trouble. By now, it was the disastrous year 167 BCE, when the angry King Antiochus, a non-Jew, rode roughshod over the accepted rules and entered the temple himself with his army. Menelaus showed him round, and when Antiochus found all his wealth, he seized it all for himself, and no one could do anything to stop him. Antiochus then decided, on a whim we think, to wipe out all signs of this eccentric religion of Jerusalem and all its customs which prevented its citizens from becoming totally Greek. So what happened? Well, if I say exterminate, that's almost the key to the order of the day. So what happened? We look to the first book of Maccabees in the Apocrypha, which gives a very good and detailed historical account of events that overtook the Jews, written later, of course, by the Maccabees when celebrating their successes. Horrors and massacres became the order of the day. Anyone found with a copy of the law or any other religious book was killed. The books were destroyed, and anyone found circumcising a new baby boy was killed together with the whole family. And when Jewish workers failed to turn up for work on the Sabbath day, they were hunted down and killed. There was no mercy. The final insult was the desecration of the temple. It was rededicated, but this time to the Greek god Zeus, with a statue set up, officially to the Greek god, but bearing a recognizable likeness to the features of King Antiochus himself. He then did no more, but ordered that pigs should be killed and offered as sacrifices on the altar. It was indeed the abomination of desolation. The Jews just could not believe what was happening to them. The rampaging Syrian soldiers then moved out into the countryside, murdering, burning, creating havoc anywhere and everywhere. And as many Jews as could fled to the hills. Some stayed behind only to be attacked on the Sabbath day. They were faced with the awful dilemma. Should they fight for their lives? But that would be breaking the law. One brave group decided to keep the Sabbath day law. They did not fight back, and consequently, they were all killed. Well, we must take in something of the scale of the atrocities which were overtaking them all, as described more vividly in the second book of the Maccabees, which possibly includes eyewitness accounts of some of them, even though they were written down years later. Two stories in particular exemplify them, described vividly in chapters 6 and 7 of 2 Maccabees. And if you dare to read them, do it on your own. Chapter 6 begins with the desecration of the temple, as I've described it. And then in verse 18, tells the story of an old Eliezer. It's a story of great courage and martyrdom, when the old man spat out the pork he'd been forced to eat. The following chapter 7 tells an even more tragic story of a mother who was forced to watch the horrendous murders of each of her 7 sons, one after the other, before being killed herself. The writer says of her, she was filled with a noble spirit. She reinforced her woman's reasoning with a man's courage. Well, these 2 chapters were the turning point. Granted, all the noble speeches were written later for the martyrs by the authors and the popular press of the time, but they do faithfully reflect the theological crisis of 167. News of all this sent shockwaves amongst the Jews, and they began to ask, where was God in all this? Why didn't he come to their aid? Had he abandoned them? How could he, the righteous one, allow his law-keeping people to be killed like this? Well, the whole concept of martyrdom began to enter their thinking. And until this time, the Jews had had no concept at all of any form of life after death, except through the lives of their children and grandchildren. Thus it always had been, and still is today, very important for Jews to have as many children as possible. Even their wisdom tradition said, "Live a good life, keep the law, and you will live long and happily." No concept of anything after death. But suddenly, all this was quite inadequate in the new disastrous times. And very wonderfully, a new theological idea began to enter their thinking. It was born out of their bewildered desperation. They remembered 2nd Isaiah's teaching, describing them as God's servant, who had been brought like a sheep to the slaughter. And they remembered that when the servant had died, he had subsequently been justified or rewarded by God. And it raised all sorts of questions. How? When? Where? And so on. The apocalyptic writings of the time helped them find answers with their visions of life with God in the heavens, surrounded with all the angelic hosts. Surely it must be in that realm that God could and would reward his very loyal people who'd been killed. They began to explore the concept that there must be, with their Greek logical thinking, be a sort of life after death. Well, it's really very surprising that they had never contemplated this before, especially when we think back into their ancient history and remember that in both the ancient cultures of Mesopotamia and Egypt, from which the Jewish faith had developed, such beliefs were common, but never among the Israelite Jews. Think back. And in the Old Testament, there are no descriptions of King David or even Solomon being buried with pomp and ceremony together with grave goods for their use in the afterlife, not like the ancient pharaohs or the ancient kings of Sargon in Mesopotamia. But back to the Jews in their disastrous situation. The speech of that youngest of the 7 sons in 2 Maccabees chapter 7 states, "Our brothers, after enduring a brief suffering, have drunk of everlasting life under God's covenant." The first hint. And then we get one of the latest psalms to get into the 150 collection in the Old Testament, Psalm 139. That eventually expressed their amazement at this new idea, that one cannot get away from God anywhere, not even in Sheol, the pit. Verses 7 to 10, and I quote from the psalm, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you're there also. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there shall your hand lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast." Well, it was a shadowy concept at first, but one taken up by the later pious ones, whom we eventually meet in the New Testament as the Pharisees. It was also at this desperate time that the last book in the Old Testament collection of prophetic texts was written, and we come at last to the book of Daniel. It had an important message for its modern readers, but the message was hidden under the guise of an historical novel. As you read the delightful stories of Daniel in the lion's den, etc., quietly substitute in your mind, and instead of King Balthazar, read King Antiochus. and take encouragement that not even he would live forever. The following chapters in Daniel 7-12 are different, written in the apocalyptic style of visions of heaven. They reflect the Persian Zoroastrian concept of the one, like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven to the Ancient of Days. And he was given dominion over the nations forever. And the book ends in chapter 12 with a message of great encouragement to persevere to the end time, when the Ancient of Days would send his archangel Michael to deliver all God's faithful people, even those who now sleep in the dust of the earth. They shall awake, it says, some to everlasting life, but some to everlasting shame and contempt. It was a confident forecast, but exasperatingly, Daniel was not given the answer to his question, when? Back to our grim story. In their darkest hour, Jewish resistance erupted. It began when the Syrian officer arrived in the village of Modin, just to the northwest of Jerusalem, and ordered the village priest Mattathias of the Hasmonean family to conduct a public sacrifice to Zeus. And the old man refused. And when one of the villagers stepped forward to carry out the order, Mattathias grabbed the sacrificial knife and killed not only him, but the Syrian officer as well. They knew that there would now be big trouble. As many as could fled to the hills again and gathered around Mattathias and his 5 sons. Soon they were joined by many others of the separatist groups, including the pious ones. Some of them, in their desperation, made the big decision, though, if they were to be attacked again on the Sabbath day, they would fight, despite the law. They became not a religious group, but a fighting force. They now journeyed round the villages, killing any Hellenist sympathizers they could find, and forcefully circumcising any of the boys who'd escaped so far. The Maccabean revolt had begun. The name Maccabee was in fact a nickname. It means the hammerers. And the wildest of Judas's sons, Mattathias' sons, was Judas. Judas Maccabeus became the leader, and war erupted. There he is. You can see the writing on the coin around his head. To the right, Judas, and then M-A, and then it follows on the left-hand side, Maccabeus, Judas Maccabeus. At first, all went well for Judas. He was supreme in the countryside and set up his headquarters at Mizpah. Meantime, Antiochus was engaged in the east, so was unaware of it. But the king had left both Antioch and his young son in the care of a man called Lysias, who did respond to the Jewish situation by taking his soldiers southwards. He went round the eastern side of the Jordan and attacked Judea from the south, quite unexpectedly, and won. But he couldn't take advantage of his success because news arrived that King Antiochus IV had died. The year 163 BCE, only 4 years after all the troubles began. Read 2 Maccabees 9 and 10, if you wish, for the full, painful story of his death, obviously written by revengeful Jews. Lysias, I'm afraid, had no option but to return to Antioch with the new boy king, Antiochus V. But he did make generous peace terms with Judas before he left. Judas now achieved his most important success. In 164 BCE, only 3 years after its desecration, he was allowed to go to Jerusalem and restore the temple. But on one condition, that he took no reprisals against any of the Hellenizers he found. The altar of Zeus was hastily removed and destroyed, and a new one installed in its place. And then the temple was rededicated on the 25th of the month Chislev. And this has been celebrated by Jews everywhere in the world since then, as the feast of Hanukkah. Usually takes place in December, and I send Christmas presents to my Jewish grandson for his celebrations of Hanukkah. Has that 9-branched candlestick, which is always in the course of 9 days, they light a different candle each day. It's a very, very big celebration for the Jews even now. Well, the rebels had won, and religious freedom had also been won. But sadly, this was not the end of a happy story, not the happy end of the story. The sons of old Mattathias were not satisfied with toleration. The Maccabean movement now developed its own different dynamic. Judas consolidated his authoritative rule. He fortified the Temple Mount again, though not the hated citadel overlooking the temple courts. And he led military campaigns throughout Judea, targeting the Hellenizers. But it was about this time that Judas began to lose the support of the pious ones, the Hasidim, as they correctly realized that the religious momentum had lost its priority. Judas went to Bozrah, where his behavior was barbaric, and then he went south to Hebron and Ashdod. After inflicting religious cleansing in these areas, he felt ready to tackle the citadel in Jerusalem. But events moved rapidly and in quick succession, all in the course of the next 3 years. And there's no need for you to remember the chaotic details I'm going to describe. Lysias returned from Antioch to Jerusalem with the new boy king and with a huge army, including elephants, as we find on Maccabees chapter 6. Jerusalem was besieged, but at the very point of capitulation, news arrived of another rebellion in Antioch. Lysias had to go again and took the boy king with him. In the year 163, a new peace treaty was agreed with very generous terms for the Jews. The disastrous high priest Menelaus was deposed and executed. But when the new legitimate high priest Onias fled to Egypt, Alcimus, a Hellenist, speedily took his place and soon executed 60 of the pious Hasidim. The Maccabees then attacked Alcimus, who fled to the king, but found himself in the presence of an unknown king, Demetrius. He had just arrived from Rome. He had straightway murdered Lysias and the boy king and proclaimed himself the new king, Demetrius I. He sent his general Nicanor to reinstate Alcimus, but at the Battle of Edessa, Nicanor was killed and the Syrian troops beaten. Well, what a political mess. Judas Maccabeus then did no more than appeal to Rome for help. Rome was delighted, not only made a treaty of friendship with Judas, it also sent a very stern letter to Demetrius, who decided that immediate action was called for. Demetrius sent a strong army into Judea, hunted down the rebels, killed Judas Maccabeus, and all this in 160 BCE, only 7 years since all these troubles had begun. The beaten Maccabees and their followers again retreated to the hills. And when Alcimus died soon after from a stroke, it signalled the end of the religious war. From now on, the story would become totally political, even for the temple. After 160, the scattered Maccabees regrouped around Mattathias' youngest son, Jonathan, a worldly and astute politician. He succeeded, grew stronger and stronger, and eventually was able to refortify both the city of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. 8 years later, he declared himself high priest, the official head of the Jewish people, and all this to the total dismay of the pious ones, the devotees of the law, and all the Zadokite members of the hereditary family of high priests. It had all gone. It's likely that this was the time when the pious ones and others talked of Jonathan as the wicked priest, and they went off into the hills above the Dead Sea, abandoning their loyalty to the temple and becoming a monastic community of the Essenes at Qumran, of much later Dead Sea Scrolls fame. But this is where their movement began. By 145, Jonathan felt strong enough to besiege the citadel in Jerusalem. And within the next 3 years, however, 142, more confusing politics resulted in his death and the succession of his brother Simon Maccabeus, old Mattathias' eldest son, who became their high priest forever, his title. Well, he finally did conquer the hated citadel overlooking the temple courts in Jerusalem, and then declared Judea to be an independent state. The first time since they'd been conquered over 450 years before in 586 and taken to exile in Babylon. Judea, now independent. Simon entered Jerusalem officially with a huge victory parade, and a song of praise follows in 1 Maccabees 14, which is almost messianic in its tone, describing Simon as the saviour of the nation and the Prince of Peace. Well, Simon ruled, beat off all opposition. He just didn't expect what happened next. In 134 BC, he was invited by his son-in-law to a banquet in Jericho, far away from Jerusalem. He went with most of his sons, only for them all to be murdered, unexpectedly. And only one absent son survived, his name John Hyrcanus. He struggled at first, but finally declared himself not only high priest, but also king of the Jews. In only 33 years, the hereditary high priesthood of the old Zadokite family had gone. The temple had been desecrated and rededicated. There had been religious extermination on an unprecedented scale, and the pious ones had disappeared into the hills. But thanks to all the power struggles, they had regained their political independence at last through the descendant of old Mattathias, John Hyrcanus. He was both king and high priest. All this by the year 134 BCE. It was a momentous 43 years. But all this was but the recipe for more political troubles to come, but we'll save them for next time. Next time will be on Sunday, the 2nd of July at 4:30 p.m. I hope you will come again and hear the next awful story. See you then. Thank you for coming today.